Welcome to Distance Learning, brought to you by the Palm Beach County School District Office of African, African American, Latino, Holocaust, and Gender Studies. Today's lesson is about Black protests, the Great Depression, and the New Deal. For this lesson, you will need to access the African American History lesson plans located on the School District of Palm Beach County Google Curriculum site. Within the lesson plans, you will find the articles that correspond to this lesson. During this lesson, we will learn about the causes of the Great Depression and describe the economic effects it had on African Americans. We will also talk about the actions African Americans took to protest racial discrimination and address the economic concerns during the Great Depression. We will also examine the New Deal. Activate your thinking. Read the question. Take a moment to think about what may have led to the Great Depression. During the early 1900s, America experienced economic prosperity. What events do you think led to the decline in prosperity and the Great Depression? Let's begin by setting the stage. There were a number of events that led to the Great Depression. European nations had to pay back all the money loaned to them by the United States over a 10-year period. Congress imposed high taxes on businesses that sold foreign goods in the United States. Both of these actions created a hardship globally and domestically. In 1929, soon after Herbert Hoover was elected as President of the United States, the stock market crashed. As a result, millions of Americans lost nearly everything. The Great Depression would last until the 1940s. This photo was taken by Margaret Burke White in 1937. It shows a line of African Americans at a government relief station during the Depression. The photo captures the harsh realities of life for African Americans and contrasts with the American dream of white prosperity. The Great Depression affected both whites and Blacks, but it worsened the racism and economic oppression of Black people. Unemployment affected all American families, but the jobless rate for African Americans was twice that of whites. The increase in unemployment in 1929 is seen in the graph pictured. This chart shows the median income of Black families compared to the median income of white families. Income for Black families was less than that of whites. Black families in the North earned 20% more than those in the South because the economic opportunities were a little different. Most Black people in the South were farmers or sharecroppers who earned less. There were a number of Black-owned businesses prior to the Great Depression. Some did not survive, such as Binga Bank, founded by Jesse Binga in Chicago. Jesse Binga was a real estate developer who started out as a barber and Pullman porter. He managed to build Binga Bank into a successful financial institution. At one point, the bank deposits had grown to $1.5 million. Unfortunately, the bank's assets were invested in mortgages of Black churches and fraternal societies who could not repay the loans during the Depression. However, some businesses did survive the Great Depression and are still around today, such as Atlanta Life Insurance Company and North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company. Many of the 250 Black hospitals and clinics and training schools did not survive. Black doctors and nurses came together to provide health care to the Black community. In the South, or in South Carolina, under the leadership of Dr. Matilda A. Evans, Black healthcare professionals, parents, business owners, and religious groups came together to put pressure on the state to provide public resources. Charitable organizations could not meet the need of the people. During this time, Herbert Hoover was president of the United States. He hesitated to respond during the Great Depression due to his belief that government should not interfere with the economy. Later, he tried to convince businesses such as banks, railroads, and insurance companies to retain employees and maintain their wages. He approved loans to these businesses in hopes of creating jobs. His plan backfired, however. Businesses kept the money and continued to lay off employees. African American people continued to fight against white supremacy and racism. The NAACP took on the task of advocating for civil rights and eliminating racism within government and education. In 1930, President Herbert Hoover attempted to appoint John Parker of North Carolina to the United States Supreme Court. Parker openly supported white supremacy. The NAACP, under the leadership of Walter White, formed a coalition to persuade the Senate to reject the nomination. They were successful. For the first time since 1854, the Senate refused to confirm a nominee. The NAACP engaged in a 20-year legal battle against Terrell Law. Terrell Law was a Texas law that banned African American participation in the Democratic primary. Lawyers such as Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston also continued to fight racial discrimination against Black students in professional and graduate schools. Black women worked with the NAACP as well and outside of the organization. Women continued to organize against racial injustice. Ella Baker, who becomes one of the most important figures of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, worked with numerous grassroots organizations. She co-founded the Young Negroes Cooperative League. She worked with women in labor groups such as the Harlem Housewife Cooperative. She also became the Assistant Field Secretary for the NAACP. She is responsible for the development of the Non-Student Violent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected President of the United States. Roosevelt started a number of programs to help counter the effects of the Great Depression. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was a federal program that pumped millions into the farming industry. However, control of the AAA resided with the Extension Services and county agricultural conservation committees, who were supposed to help all farmers. But the committee was rooted in Southern politics. Many sharecroppers and tenant farmers were evicted from the land as white landlords pocketed millions of dollars in benefits. The National Industrial Recovery Act intended to revive manufacturing by allowing industries to cooperate in establishing codes of conduct to govern prices, wages, and employment practices. It was regulated by the National Recovery Administration, who faced resistance from employers and unions in regards to addressing racial disparities. Blacks should have received pay increases, but they were pushed out of jobs and replaced with whites. The New Deal created several welfare programs. One was the Civil Conservation Corps. This was a voluntary public relief program. Young men and women would learn skills, or young men would learn skills, not women, while they worked on environmental projects. You will read more about this program in Lesson 2. The New Deal gave the illusion of providing assistance to African Americans, but due to racism, it did not help Blacks as much as it helped whites economically. But FDR's presidency did create the opportunity for African Americans to advance politically. African Americans were able to form an alliance of some sort with the Roosevelt administration. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was committed to the fight against racial injustice. She insisted that President Roosevelt consider legislation for Black rights. She wrote newspaper articles calling for fair play and equal opportunity for Negro citizens. She resigned as member of the Daughters of the American Revolution after the organization did not allow Marian Anderson, a young Black opera singer, to perform at its Constitutional Hall in Washington in 1939. Liberals, along with Eleanor Roosevelt, pushed for the appointment of more African Americans throughout government. President Roosevelt appointed someone in his administration to assume responsibility for ensuring that African Americans receive fair treatment. This led to the development of the Black Cabinet. The Black Cabinet was an informal group of highly placed African American advisors to FDR. Two of the leaders of the Black Cabinet were Mary McLeod Bethune and Robert Weaver. Mary McLeod Bethune played a powerful role in Roosevelt's Black Cabinet. In the 1920s, she was the leader of the National Association of Colored Women and later founded the National Council of Negro Women. Weaver later served as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Lyndon B Johnson, the first African American cabinet secretary. He spearheaded the passage of the Housing Act of 1968, which expanded opportunities for Black home ownership. In conclusion, the United States Supreme Court invalidated most of the first New Deal. FDR created a second New Deal, which consisted of the Social Security Act, the National Labor Relations Act, the Works Progress Administration. The second New Deal also had its challenges in regards to economic oppression. For example, at that time, the Social Security Act excluded domestic and agricultural workers. These were jobs held mostly by African Americans. The second New Deal survived legal challenges. Politically, Blacks began to use politics as a means of improving their economic conditions. Also, FDR was able to gain support of African Americans, which led to his reelection in 1936. The deal helped, but it did not erase the racism and economic oppression that African Americans continued to face. This concludes week one's lesson of the Black protests, the Great Depression, and the New Deal. As you reflect on today's lesson, think of 3 things you've learned, 2 things you would like to learn about, and 1 more question you may still have. Thank you for listening.